Why did God repeat his instructions concerning the yearly feasts? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Exodus on walking through the Bible.
The glory of his cross.
If you have a Bible with you, you can turn to Exodus 34. We're going to be reading from verses 18 to 22. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So, Exodus 34, beginning at verse 18. The feast of unleavened bread you shall keep. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, as I commanded you, in the appointed time of the month of Abib. For in the month of Abib you came out from Egypt. All that open the womb are mine, and every male firstborn among your livestock, whether ox or sheep. But the firstborn of a donkey you shall redeem with a lamb, and if you will not redeem him, then you shall break his neck. All the firstborn of your sons you shall redeem, and none shall appear before me empty-handed. 6 days you shall work, but on the 7th you shall rest. In the plowing time and harvest you shall rest. And you shall observe the feast of weeks, of the first fruits of wheat harvest, and the feast of ingathering at the year's end. In this chapter we have God renewing his covenant with Israel. This covenant needed renewed because the children of Israel had gone off and worshipped idols, something that God had expressly forbidden them to do and which he would not accept. It took Moses fervently pleading with God to forgive them in order for God not to destroy them and make a great nation of Moses. It is for this reason that God needed to repeat his instructions concerning the covenant. He will not repeat everything that we read of earlier, but he will repeat some things. In this episode and in the next, we will discuss God's words concerning the feasts that he wanted Israel to observe, as well as some other related matters. Although we have discussed these feasts in this series before, we will shortly discuss them again, so as to review in our minds what they were. The Feast of Unleavened Bread and the Feast of the Passover were celebrated together, for they reminded the children of Israel of their leaving Egypt. It would take place in the month of Abib, beginning on the night of the 14th day of the month and ending 8 days later. For the Passover meal, they were to kill a lamb of the first year, spread the blood of the lamb on the doorposts and lintels of their houses, roast the lamb, and eat it that very night. During the Feast of Unleavened Bread, they were to clear their houses of all leavening and eat only bread that was unleavened, reminding them how quickly they left Egypt. On the first day and on the last day of this feast, there would be a holy convocation to the Lord. Attached to their exit from Egypt was the fact that all male firstborn of their sheep and oxen were to be dedicated to the Lord and sacrificed. Donkeys, because they were unclean and could not be offered, were to be redeemed with the sacrifice of a lamb. If they were not to redeem this animal, they were to break its neck. Even the male firstborns of each house was to be dedicated to the Lord. However, the Lord never desires human sacrifice, so they too were to be redeemed. God then moves on to the Sabbath. The Sabbath was first introduced in chapter 16, but was discussed again in chapter 20, chapter 23, and chapter 31. Why did God repeat himself so many times? Because in chapter 16, the children of Israel didn't keep the Sabbath. They profaned it. So important was the Sabbath to God in his covenant with Israel that he repeated his instructions several times. The Sabbath day was the 7th day of the week, in which nobody was to work, not servants, not masters, not men, not women, not even animals. It was a day of total rest from their 6 days of labor. Coming now to the Feast of First Fruits of the wheat harvest. This is known as the Feast of Weeks for the first time in the Bible, having been discussed way back in chapter 23. The Feast of Weeks was a feast in the late spring that would become known in the New Testament as the Feast of Pentecost. It is where the Hebrews were to bring the first fruits of their harvest to the Lord, the first fruits that were told not to be delayed back in chapter 22. As we will see in our later studies, the first of the first fruits was to be offered on the first day after the Sabbath, corresponding with the Passover, in other words, the first day of the week, and it would be this offering that would begin the counting of the Feast of Weeks, which would be 7 Sabbaths plus 1 day after the first offering of first fruits. This corresponds to 50 days, hence the name Pentecost. The final feast discussed here is the Feast of Ingathering, which would be later known as the Feast of Tabernacles. It would occur at the end of the year and would occur around the same time as the Day of Atonement in the 7th month of the year. If the Feast of Passover is in the 1st month of the year, corresponding to our late March and early April, then the Feast of Tabernacles would correspond to our October. This feast corresponded to the end of the harvest. In our next episode, we're going to find that these 3 feasts were special feasts to the Lord that contain special requirements. So we'll hope you'll join us in the next episode for a review of those requirements. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Exodus chapter 34, verses 23 to 28, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.
Of his cross.